Thanks, Betsy. And thank you, each one of you gathered here in community this morning with gratitude and joy to celebrate life, to celebrate the relationships that we are learning from and through and with. And I am just so grateful that the time is right for me this morning to be able to share with you something that I have been working on for about 4 years. We know metaphysically that 4 is the number of preparation, and perhaps after almost 4 years, there is some ripeness for me in this message, and I ask that I be a blessing through that. So I'm back to practicing joke telling to open, and this one kind of relates. I'm not sure. I just like it. Did you hear about the mathematician who's afraid of negative numbers? He'll stop at nothing to avoid them. Tee-hee. I see Betsy's giggling. That's good. And I think she's a numbers person. You know what, though? I think what called to me about that joke in terms of this morning's message is the word avoidance. I think avoidance is a tactic of the ego that is very easy to miss and to not acknowledge. And so this morning's talk about bringing life to all of our relationships really has to do with a greater understanding of the power that we call life. And I am moved and inspired by 2 different scriptures that I would like to share now. We affirm every Sunday that we are practically applying the teachings of the Master that our tradition follows, which is Jesus, who is Jesus the Christ. And one of the readings is from the Old Testament. The first of these is from Psalm 16, and it reads, "Thou wilt show me the path of life, and I will be filled with the joy of thy countenance, with the pleasure of victory of thy right hand." So that's Psalm 16, verse 11. "Thou wilt show me the path of life, and I shall be filled with the joy of thy countenance and the pleasure of victory of thy right hand." The other scripture is from Colossians 3, verse 1 through 4. And it says, "If you are then risen with Christ, seek those things which are above, where Christ sits. Set your affections on things above, not on things of the earth. For ye are dead, and your life is hid with Christ in God. When Christ, who is our life, shall appear, then shall ye also appear with him in glory." So we really take those words in at depth about this definition in Colossians, in Paul's letter, of what life is. That life involves being risen with Christ, which for me is a rise, a lift in my consciousness, in my awareness. When I seek those things that are of above and I let go of the things on earth, then I have life. I have the life as Colossians describes it, the life that is hid with Christ. In connection with this understanding of the life that we bring to all of our relationships, it was interesting to me that that is how the message title came through me, was bringing life, probably all of us here had enough grammar and teaching about the proper use of verbs that we might remember that generally the verb to bring is reserved for motion toward, and take is reserved for motion away from. My suspicion is that this has been mostly lost in our world of technology. However, at first glance at the message title for today, bringing life into all of our relationships, I thought, bringing is motion toward. I am bringing the life that is hid in Christ forward from within self. So I had to pause and understand the use of that particular verb for activating the power of life in myself, that I consciously, deliberately make the decision to bring the life within that is hid with Christ, to bring it forth into all of my relationships in the outer. We understand that relationships, other than when we commune in the silence with the God of our understanding, I believe that some of the greatest learning outside of listening to the still small voice happens in our opportunities in relationship. And of course, we invoke a pillar of our unity teachings, which is the silence. And to move into making these choices about activating life in how we relate to others, I'd like to quote from Deepak Chopra this morning, who says that in order for us to make the right choices in life, he says, you have to get in touch with your soul. In order to make right choices in life, I have to get in touch with my soul. He says to do this, you need to experience solitude. Then he goes on in an observation that I think might have more relevance and clarity in the last couple of years. He says, however, most people are afraid of solitude because in the silence you hear the truth and you know the solutions. You need to experience solitude. And so we just check in with ourselves this morning and notice if there is any residual fear of solitude, because it is in solitude, in the silence, that we hear the truth and we know the solutions. So we come together in community with like-minded souls, all of us vibrating at a similar frequency, in order to celebrate the times that we do spend in solitude, to celebrate the notion of silence and solitude, bringing the fruit of prayer. And when we are in community, affirming the power of the silence and of solitude, then my faith tells me that that belief in silence and in solitude and in its fruit, which is greater life expressing in and through me, that I then bring that life beyond just me, and it radiates forth as the life of God from each and every one of us. So let's just pause for a moment, as I have many times in the last week and a half or so, in considering what I have gleaned and learned about this topic of bringing life to all of our relationships. First of all, it's important that I share with you what it is that I am defining as life, because how can I be deliberate, awake, aware that I am bringing more of life to my relationships if I don't say what I am calling life? So for me, life is that quality that lives me. The quality of life of God in me is changeless. It is eternal. And it expresses in 3 primary relationships. And these are the relationships that we're going to take some time to consider, to explore, and to go within, to take our own personal inventory of these 3 relationships. When I said to you in the introduction that I've been studying this notion of bringing life to relationships, I've been doing so with a particular teaching, a particular text that came to me just about 4 years ago when I was very closely involved in my youngest brother's crises. He is 15 years younger than I am. Before I left for university, I was very much in the role of mother with him. But just about 4 years ago, in terms of the life that he had created, which was no longer working for him, I noticed an old pattern of how I tended to react in relationship coming up. I had awareness that as the drama and the specifics and the seeming hopelessness that he was expressing was increasing, I noticed my own tendency to want to cut away, disconnect. Apparently, the readiness for bringing life into relationships was starting to germinate as a seed in me, because what I heard was, find another way rather than avoidance, rather than distancing, rather than cutting away from the discomfort of this relationship. And so I called a therapist friend of mine, and she recommended this book, which really forms the backbone of today's message. And I ask to be a blessing, and I begin with the gratitude for this opportunity that has culminated in my sharing it. And you probably can't see the title, but it's called Growing Yourself Up, How to Bring Your Best to All of Life's Relationships. When I have shared this in small groups, it triggers some people just like it triggered me. Growing yourself up? What are you talking about? And indeed, her name is Dr. Jenny Brown. I won't go into her credentials, her background too much, but she is the founder of an institute in Sydney, Australia, that focuses on family systems and the Bowen theory. But most of all, this book, Growing Yourself Up, How to Bring Your Best to All of Life's Relationships, involves looking at 3 main relationships. And I will tell you that I do not think I could have stayed the course with this book if in her description of 3 relationships, it was not aligned with my hierarchy already 4 years ago of relationships, which is my primary relationship is with the Lord of my being, with the God that I am one with. And so the 3 relationships, just for starters, are my relationship with God. This one that I think I fell down on for a long time in my particular pattern, my relationship with myself as part of God. And then, and only then, when I have straightened myself out about my relationship with God that lives in me, with the self that is expressing as my humanity, not just my God self. And then comes my relationship with all those others who I courageously and confidently call my teachers, however it looks sometimes. I'm going to start by sharing with you that very late place in her professional writing where she talks about this primary relationship being the one with spirit, with source, with God. And here's what she says. I made a conscious choice in this work to focus on relationship among fellow human beings. The ideas that I have shared in this book apply to and have been very beneficial, not just in my own life, but in the lives of many others. However, as my life has progressed, I have come to believe that the most important relationship to address in growing myself up is my relationship with the Creator. My relationship with the Creator. She says not every reader will agree with this view. What a courageous writer, right? That she's writing this largely clinical text, and yet she very bravely says, I know some of you may not agree with this view, that the most important relationship is the one that I have with God. But she says, this is how I keep myself in perspective, as small, as vulnerable, as well as graciously cared for. I think this has assisted in some way for me to reduce my natural self-centeredness in my human relationships. And so then she gives us a very lovely personal invitation to explore what we believe about God, what we believe about life. And so those are really the pillars of my message this morning, are the relationship that we have with God, that we acknowledge that when we are aware of our inseparability from the Spirit, that we are in our true identity, that we are one with Spirit. When we acknowledge that, then that is the life that lives us. That is the life that, as Paul said in one of his letters, it is not I that lives, but the Christ that liveth me. And that, I believe, is what I daily inspire and aspire to, is to live and to allow that life, which is the Christ, to be lived through me, through all of me. Coming back for a moment to bringing life to all of my relationships and to Dr. Jenny Brown's primary thesis in her work, which deals with maturity, with growing ourselves up in terms of how we show up. Most especially, how am I showing up in my relationships with other people? Although she defines maturity as a lot of different things in her work, above all, I have come to appreciate, to understand better, and to seek to apply the definition of growing myself up to be mature as emotionally resilient. So the degree of my maturity, how grown up am I today in how I'm relating to those that I say I love? How much life am I bringing to those relationships really is dependent on two or three things. It has everything to do with the degree of our emotional maturity and understanding, and the amount of emotional resilience that I can bring when I show up as opposed to cutting off. So I'm just going to circle back for a minute to just create the framework for this growing myself up, which I've been working on very closely with Dr. Brown's guidelines for the last 4 years. I believe I shared that once I looked into her work, I knew that there was healing, there was opportunity for growing up, maturing emotionally, and above all, that there was opportunity for real intimacy, real relationship with my brother. And I was very awake to the fact that I came this close to doing what I had done to survive so many times up until 4 years ago, which was when it was too painful in the story I told myself to hurt other people, then I would cut off. And none of that was actually real. It is only by allowing God as the life in me to flow freely, first of all, to how I love myself. And it is only with cultivating a healthy relationship with God who will then guide me in loving myself. It is only then that I can clearly define how that life flows through from me. I have brought it to me by my oneness with God. I then bring it to my human self from my spiritual self. And so we want to bring the best, don't we, to all of our relationships. So I have a feeling in preparing for today, I had the strong sense that this is a message that may naturally unfold in 2 segments. So it's taken me a lifetime of teaching. I started in a bathroom in my childhood home when I was 5 years old. Some of you have heard me say I seconded all 4 cousins and siblings who were younger than me, and I sat them in the bathtub where there happened to be a little black slate. And I am still learning how to contain the message in chunks that, first of all, I can absorb and that I can fairly invite you to absorb. So my sense is that this conversation about bringing the best of me to my relationships, which is the life of God, will unfold over 2 Sundays. And we'll all know that at the end of today, whether that's true or not. So here's the thing. Here's the real thing to not avoid. Listen to this essential statement that comes from the text, growing myself up, and see if that triggers you, if it creates any sense of avoidance or of wanting to cut off from it. She says, we must be willing to become aware of those parts of ourselves that are stunted or immature aspects of our human self. We are encouraged through her work to leave behind the self-entitled inner child and to strengthen our inner adult. I'll say that again. Through her work, through the guiding principles of her work, we are encouraged to notice where the self-entitled inner child is activated in how we show up in relationships. And to also notice that our intention, our goal this morning is to strengthen the inner adult in terms of what really is principle directed living. She calls it relational living, okay, which for me is easier to understand as there are certain principles that I wish to bring in living to my relationships. So it's lovely that she expresses that as every one of us is involved in relational living. However, we are involved in various degrees of wakefulness about what the life is that we bring to those relationships. Is it the life of God? Is it the life that is pure? Is it the life that is changeless? Is it the life that is the power showing up as grace and light and love that I must begin with, because that is the life of God. I love that Betsy spoke of transformation in the introduction, just like Jackie also joins us in the lyrics of part of her song, in which she talked about living from truth. This is what we're coming together, folks, to do this morning. We recognize that any transformation that we might seek in expressing more life in our relationships must begin with awareness and the willingness to have a shift, a transformation occur. And so I think for the purposes of this morning's message, we will contain the guiding principles of how to grow myself up within this morning's message. So here are some of the steps that she recommends. And then this part of the message, I will close by giving you a succinct 4-step method that you no doubt have heard before, because it's been out in the general race consciousness for some time. So she talks first and foremost about governing our mind, our thinking nature, and our emotional nature must work together if we want to bring life to our relationships. So in twinning our emotional nature with our thinking, what I call having access to my frontal lobe, in twinning my feelings with my thinking, how much, to what extent does my thinking guide my behavior, especially with those people in my life, those teachers who come to touch what might be unhealed in me? So that's the first step, using my feelings as well as my thinking to guide me. Of course, this notion of becoming awake and staying awake and aware of my feelings, how much am I able to tap into my heart, into my emotional nature, and to use them as a guide to the important things I bring to a relationship? And to what extent am I able to look at myself, think about myself, and observe how I'm showing up, like the objective, the Buddhist objective observer of self, and say, how's that balance between thinking and feeling showing up right now, as opposed to what happens or can happen, which is to be caught up in the emotion of the moment, at which point we have no choice but fall back on the old brain, the reactive brain. So that's the first step, twinning my feelings and my thinking mind. The second step is really to have, and we talk about this quite a bit in unity circles, to have clearly defined guiding principles. Okay, so what's important to me as a guiding principle? What's the value of my life that I bring when I relate to other people? And noticing that when I compromise those values, whenever I belittle those most important things, which you've heard me say, for me is God, regardless of the relationship in the outer, the degree to which I compromise those values that I hold sacred is the exact degree in which I will be hurting first myself and then inevitably others. Because if I have clearly defined, let's say just for argument's sake, I'm sure each of you has defined what the top 3 values are in life. And certainly the intimacy of relationship is really high for me, but understanding myself and growing myself up had to come before that eventually. It wasn't always. But if I love God and if I say that I need to love myself, as the Master said, so that I can truly love others, then I need to put my values, my principles, my goals into how I show up in relationships. So that's the second step. The third step is really growing the emotional maturity that allows me to see the interconnectedness of all life. So what does that mean? To be able to see the interconnectedness of all life, regardless of what relationship I'm in, whether it's with my daughters, my aging parents, my brothers, who I call difficult at times, but whom I love to pieces. And so what is involved in this part of growing myself up that requires seeing the interconnectedness of relating? Do you know what? For me, therein lies the sanctity, the sacredness of relationship. Because guess what? We're not really interconnected as if, by a thread. We are one. We are one. I am every other relationship. I am every other soul by virtue of us springing from the same source. So in terms of appreciating that oneness, how much am I caught up when I'm in a relationship? How much am I caught up in my own needs or whatever is upsetting me in it, that it blinds my ability to, even for a split second, consider how I'm reacting and behaving that has to do with that inner child in me, as opposed to the interconnectedness, the oneness calling me to appreciate and to see, what's the other person in this exchange dealing with in this moment? So that's the interconnectedness. When we think about worry or agitation, let's think about it and let's let it go, right? So anxiety, agitation, these impulsive reactions, all of this has to do, folks, with the emotional maturity to regulate ourselves. How do we regulate ourselves in a mature way? By coming back to step number 1 and twinning our emotional and our thinking nature. And so let's take a deep breath as we recognize that sometimes this is a full-time job just to regulate ourselves in that way. And so we bring ourselves in relationship with others often back to the breath. Have you noticed that in those moments that are emotionally very, very high, that just that simple step of bringing my attention back to my breath, which is life, which is God living me, suddenly I have some balance. Suddenly I can regulate myself. This next step has been more challenging for me, and I can say that in the first couple of years of doing this, it was very new for me. And that is the ability to stay in the relationship that feels like it's on fire and to notice my level of tolerance for the discomfort. Okay? Stay connected, she says. Stay connected no matter how uncomfortable it is, and notice your own, or in my case, I was noticing the level of my tolerance for the discomfort. And so now I call that for myself. I call it, hey, Roz, how comfortable are you with this discomfort? And more, guys, I can say I'm getting more comfortable with the discomfort in this relationship because I know it holds a healing for me. The last thing is one that represented a huge healing for me as teacher, as mother, as sister, I suppose first and foremost as child of God. This last step is to ask myself the question, in how many areas of my life am I doing for others what they would benefit from learning to do for themselves? So just look at the different relationships. I mean, that's what I do on a daily basis. I notice, are there still areas in my life where I feel tempted for whatever reason to show up and do for others what they would benefit from learning to do for themselves? You know, as we move through this maturation process, as we agree that we want to grow ourselves up more, and I guess we'll do that by coming back next Sunday to look at some more of these guiding principles. But please know that one of the most painful parts of agreeing to grow myself up that she warned me about, Dr. Jenny Brown did. However, until you're in the fire, it's impossible to know how painful it is. Once we have made this decision that we will show up as a healthy, differentiated, clearly defined adult self, no longer borrowing self from others or giving up self. Okay. So once I made that decision, please know others that you have been in relationship with will challenge your choice. It's their job. They will not like it. They will challenge it and they will seek to find ways to get me to go back to my predictable way of behavior, you know, which for me was going along to get along, keeping the peace at any cost. Hello. And what happens to the healthy, differentiated self? So I need to be able to ask myself, how can I continue to choose the course of my healthy, differentiated adult while acknowledging aspects of that inner child that might still be healing? Oh, how lovely to get to share the fruit of my study, of my prayer with all of you. Thank you so much for allowing me to do this. I just want to close with what helped me this week internalize, integrate this, letting life into my relationships. Interestingly enough, it is, remember I said in my introduction, it's been around for a while, but its simplicity comes from Toltec wisdom. And it is the 4 agreements, which you probably heard about decades ago. And yet truth is truth. And I find this a succinct way to grow myself up. And here they are to close our time together this morning. To be impeccable with my word means that I engage my frontal lobe before I talk. So in terms of Dr. Brown's, you know, make sure you're engaging your mind and your heart. Be impeccable with my word, because what I put forth, as we heard last Sunday, never returns to me void. It is a frequency that's out there. So the first agreement that I make with myself in growing myself up is to be impeccable with my word. The second one is not to take things personally. This requires emotional maturity to be able to recognize projections. Do not take things personally. You know how I said it's interesting when we're learning something to notice what doesn't stay in mind. And I noticed for me, I'm not sure why yet, maybe the why doesn't matter, but the third agreement of Dr. Don Miguel Ruiz in his book, by the way, The Four Agreements. The third one is make no assumptions. Don't make any assumptions. This requires the courage to ask questions. This requires a healthy, differentiated self to find voice, to be able to get rid of assumptions. The biggest assumption I believe that I still see rampant is the assuming that you think you know what another person is thinking. And that, folks, by definition, is insane. So let's just leave that behind. Do not make any assumptions. And the fourth agreement is something that as Unity students, as followers of the path of life that is informed by God as life, we are always doing our best, and we can grant others the right to change, to transform, to grow on their own schedule, because we understand that they too are doing the best at any moment with what they know. Oh, thank you, Father. Thank you, Mother, Father, life that is living me, for this greater understanding of the richness of human relationships as a path toward allowing more of God to live me, toward allowing more of God to love me and myself from self, so that others can be in the light of my radiating that life. And so it is.